Hello and welcome to Cisco Knowledge Base. This is Zach from Content Security. In today's topic, we'll be discussing how to configure L4TM, which is a layer 4 traffic monitoring with the virtual appliance. So L4 traffic monitor functionality has been there for years. As to what has changed on the appliance in our 7.7.5 release, which is a virtual appliance, and there are some additional steps required to configure on the VM host side of it, and we'll run through these steps, block some traffic, and run some tests. To keep it concise, essentially, when setting up the virtual WSA on the VMware on the ESXi server, we have to define a promiscuous port, which is it can accept traffic from any other port on the machine itself and then span it. So the steps we will run through is, number one, we'll create a virtual switch on the ESXi servers. In my example, I added a second network interface card on the ESXi host to build vSwitch. And then we'll go and edit the default setting of properties to allow promiscuous mode on our virtual switch that we just create on that step. Then we'll edit a port group, which is the span actually on that vSwitch. And then we'll assign that port group to that T1 interface. So in my example, I'm using T1 interface for in and out traffic. The next part, which is step number 5, remains the same. We create a monitor session span port and is also known as a port mirroring. Pretty straightforward step. Enabling L4TM on virtual appliance and configure, just for testing, additional suspected malware address. And that part, again, step number 6 is always and has not changed. It's the same. To look at the traffic for successful or a failure, we want to tail the trafmon log on WSA command line, and run some tests from a client. They are able to send traffic through this virtual appliance. In my test, I am using VMware ESXi host running 5.0 and virtual web security appliance at 7.7.5 release. And then I have a Windows 2008 R2. It's a non-active directory mode as a test client. So there are some other points and we'll come back to it. So with that, let's start looking at how to create a virtual switch and then edit and modify the port mode. So this is my vCenter. The host that I have created on this, the one we're going to be using in this test, is 172.18.254.65. So let's expand this window a little bit so we can see a little bit better. And in my example, I have already created a vSwitch, but we will step through the options. So this is my second vSwitch that I created. The standard vSwitch for other VM that already running it's called vSwitch. So it's a vSwitch, standard vSwitch 0. So when you create a second vSwitch, it's going to name automatically, and it's a standard vSwitch 1. So the first thing first, as we looked at our steps to creating a virtual switch and then edit these settings. To create, okay. So remember where we at? We are at the host configuration tab, then networking. On the top bar, we'll say add networking. That's where we want to click for create a vSwitch. On the bottom, that's just the properties you modify, but that's where you create a new vSwitch. There's a couple of ways to do it. Just take the default virtual machine, add a label network. And when I created it, it gives you an option if you have a NIC card, additional NIC card. It was listed here. But in this case, I don't have a third one. So I have an option. I can just create another vSwitch using the switch 0 that already on the machine, or I can create another vSwitch using vSwitch 1 that has already been created, right? But so the recommendations are, if you are using a separate NIC card, just create a second switch instead of using the standard vSwitch 0. Once you do that, and then label it, next, and finish. That's where it's finished, and it will give you an option to put a name in here. In my example, I'll show you in a minute what I called it actually. So next, 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 and finish here. So once I finish here, it created this switch here. So I called it a span port for ESXi when I created the vSwitch. Once I created the vSwitch, then I went into the vSwitch 1, click here in properties. So when you create a vSwitch, you go to add networking, but when you modify properties, then you go on for the particular switch, then you sits within the group. Properties. So as you notice here, I have a port group, span port for ESXi. My vSwitch, this is actually vSwitch 1. And it's important to know because if you go and click properties vSwitch 0, it will tell you the exact same thing. It will say vSwitch. So that's important to make sure which property you are modifying, not the old switch that already was there and working. And this is a new one that we just created on the bottom of the page, vSwitch 1. So on vSwitch 1, we'll go under properties. Okay. Then we'll click edit. So here are the things that need to modify. So in this page, this is all good. Number of ports by default is 120, meaning there are 120 ports, virtual port that is, not 18, not 24, not 16, 120 virtual ports. And empty, you leave that as it is. This can be modified if you have more machine, you're going to create more than 120 on that switch. Security, that's where this will come as promiscuous mode, default setting is reject. So make sure it's set to accept all three of them. Traffic shaping, disable it because we're not doing any traffic shaping yet on this machine. NIC teaming. So under NIC teaming for load balancing, just do a route based on the originated virtual port ID, network failure, link status only, and notify switch and fallback. So if I have a multiple physical adapter, then I can also do a failover order. So this is setting all in the vSwitch. So leave that default. Security, make sure all accept. Traffic shaping, disable. NIC teaming, make sure similar to this route based on originating. Link status only, and yes for notify and fallback. Failback rather. Okay, let's see. So we want to close that out. It's been already made, so let's see. The next part, let's go back to our notes here. So we talked about this, 1, then we talked about 2, which is property changing on the vSwitch. Now the port group. I called it span port for ESXi. Similar thing, we want to make sure, go to edit. In this case, when I created that, you notice you can edit all VLAN or non-zero. So all VLAN. Just to keep it simple, I added all VLANs, and you can optionally change that whichever VLAN your T1 wants to reside or isolate. Under security, this will be the exact same, which is you want to accept promiscuous mode, MAC address change, and forge transmit for spanning. Traffic shaping is also disabled on the port group as well. And NIC teaming, we just want to know the network failover detection, link status only. So if I have a multiple physical adapter, then I can override this and change the order by moving up and down. This option will be available if you have a multiple interfaces, physical card that is. So we'll cancel out. So that concludes and covers step number 3 on port group. What we need to do next is to make sure the T1 interface is assigned to the right port group we just created. So to do that, this is the virtual WSA that we're working with. Do a right click on it and do edit setting. So virtual appliance, right click, edit setting. That will allow you to modify any of the setting. If we look at it, the port setting. So starting from the top, the network adapters. This is M1, P1, P2, T1, and T2. So what needs to happen here is, since I'm using T1 for in and out traffic, so all I need to do, click this. Here, default will be to your VM network, whatever the main port group or the switch, vSwitch you have. So in my example, since I created the second vSwitch and a port group, just labeled it as a network, labeled it span port for ESXi, just to keep it simple. And that's what you need to do. And that covers basically step number 4, assigning that T1. So in the test that if you are doing both T1 and T2, you can also do a T2 as well for the same port group as needed. So we'll cancel out of here. Alright, so moving on. Step number 5. So creating a monitoring session, and if you don't create a port mirroring or spanning or monitor session, whatever you call it, a T1 port is blind. We're not getting any copy. There's nothing you're going to see as to why is it not blocking anything. You can add in the block list all day long, but if the T1 port doesn't see a traffic, it will not take any action. Actually, there's some of the notes in here. So 2 conditions must be met for L4TM to take any action. T1 port must see the traffic, client traffic that is, and L4TM block list, which is blacklist or manual block list under GUI interface to be added. So if these 2 conditions are met, then it will be able to achieve a desired results. So we'll continue with the step number 5, create monitor session and support port. Let's jump over to our switch. So here's our switch. In the example, on my switch, the gig Ethernet 01 is the one is connected my first NIC card on the ESXi server. Gig Ethernet 2, where the second port or second NIC card from Ethernet, second NIC card is connected on gig Ethernet 02. And the reason we see protocol part is down, because it's a span port, and that's a pretty common, right? So if you have a port that is been participating in span, the protocol STP part will be down. So look at the config, and actual 2-line of config is pretty straightforward. Again, kept it simple just because we want to make sure we watch all the traffic. So in my example, I did monitor session 1, source VLAN 1 through 4094, and then monitor session 1 destination interface gig Ethernet 02. So gig Ethernet 02, where is the second NIC card is connected, and then second vSwitch is tied with that NIC card. So that's all the port mirroring here required. So we'll go back to our steps here. So we did that as well, actually create monitoring session right here, and enable L4TM and WSA and configure additional. So that part is step number 6, step number 7, step number 8. These are all historically that has not changed. So 1 through 4 is the one most critical in order to get virtual appliance L4TM functionality to get it working. So, but we'll look at it 6, 7, and 8 as well. So in my example, this is my virtual appliance, and I have enabled, in my example, I have enabled it on all ports. So I'm monitoring on all ports. Conversely, administrator can go in and say all port except port 80 and 443, and that's an option as well. So once the client go in and try to access in any other port other than 80 and 443, that will work and take an action. So with 80 and 443, if you choose to do that, what happens is T1 never receives port 80 and 443 traffic. Since it never received those traffic, it cannot take any action. So that's why I have it all port, and we'll look at our example. Cancel out of here, and it's enabled and all that. The other thing is to show, in my example, I have this setting for L4TM. So if you look at it, action for suspected malware addresses, I want to block it and include ambiguous addresses when blocking. Just to do an example, additional suspected malware, I have www.example.com is the one in a block list, or blacklist, or you call it. So that's all from here. Now let's jump over to the test client. And bring it here. So this is Windows 2008 R2 test client, and on these test client, this is not participating in Active Directory domains. It's a simple Windows 2008 R2. Added a couple of utilities just to tell it to do some testing. We'll do in a minute. For normal traffic, let's jump over to the logs as well. So since we are, if you remember, we are watching, let's go back here, our L4TM. We are monitoring all port, and in our blacklist, we are saying www.example.com, want you to block it. So anything in here, let's type Google. So expected behavior is port 80, port 443 should work. Only thing I have is that example.com is the one that is blocking. So that's the behavior that I want to see, example.com. As soon as I type example.com, I got to reset. And if we jump over to our logs, we should see that. So May 30th, time, firewall block, TCP data. This is my client IP. And then here is the port 80. So this is a port 80 traffic. And again, this is a TCP data, as we see. And port 80. What we also can do, a couple of tests, is, I believe I have some stuff in here. So example.com, if you look at the IP address, that's the IP address for 192.0.43.10. So let's go ahead and ping that address. .43.10. So since we have a policy in place, and that's again, it's old school, since we have a policy in place that we do not allow example.com, ICMP should also fail. And as we see it here, we just got a log prompt that ICMP from 172.18.254.68, which is the client, is failed and going to 192.0.43.10. Similarly, we can try telnet, and we all know telnet is port 23 data, TCP, port 23. And we should have another TCP block port. So this time, firewall block, TCP data from 172.18.254.68, client again. And if you look at 192.0.43.10, and there's a port number 23, and that's the telnet port that we just tried in. So again, once you have that setup, L4TM is still the same, just like if you are working on the physical boxes. So that part has not changed. Last part to this presentation, just to include the GUI part as well. What's the GUI look like for L4TM? For this test, go L4TM under reporting, and as we can see the data just for past couple of days, we can also change this from the time range clause. As you can tell, I've been aggressively testing layer 4 traffic monitor through virtual appliance for past few days. So all these clients IP here, all these sites, malware sites, been added for testing, and some more data. This part has not changed from the historical perspective, so just wanted to have this view as well. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back to what do we have. So we talked about all that. So this is just a note. If we are monitoring all port except 80 and 443, then port 80, 443 won't make it to T1 and access will be allowed. So this is all good as well. So for troubleshooting, what you want to do, let's say if things are not working, you can, once you have your vSwitch set up, your properties to default mode to set to promiscuous, to allow to span, and run through the port group, assign the port group to T1, and span your port, port mirroring, and then just to make sure if you're still not able to block with the config, you all ran through it. Just do a ping like we did here in our test scenario. Let's go back here. Actually down here. So when we did a ping test on here, it says destination host unreachable. And the telnet is also failed because we have in the block list. So you can do a ping, and then you can do a capture as well. So there one time You can do on T1 and T2, depend what you're using. You want to see if there's traffic making into it. You can also do a TCP dump on ESXi host just to make sure if the traffic is coming to the main switch, vSwitch that you create. And then a reverse telnet that we just tried, and basically to generate any sort of traffic to see if the T1 port is seeing it. If it's seeing it, it should take an action. Okay. Okay, so just to run through the overview page real quick, what we talked about it. Configuring virtual WSA with layer 4 traffic monitoring. It just required additional configuration on the ESXi host. If you have an ESXi running inside the UCS, it will still require. The recommendations are to create a separate vSwitch. Once you create a vSwitch, modify the default property to promiscuous mode. Once you do that, then assign your port group and then change the mode on a port group as well. Then add the virtual machine to your T1 interface. Once you do that, create a monitoring port mirroring, and then have site testing with any sites. In my example, in my test, I have example.com and run through the log. So with that, that covers this topic. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon and day and evening. Thank you.